This course is a very heavy course. As I'm sure you realize by now, we're 5 weeks in. And I don't filibuster in these classes. We're here to really cover lots of ground. And today is, again, one of those classes. Got lots to talk about, lots to go through. So, okay, survival of a nation. And let us begin by thanking our core sponsors. Nancy Trias, Bethany Lynn Morocco, and Toby and Larry Fox. Thank you all for bringing this wonderful course for all of us here. And we're on to lesson 5. The war is over. Spoke about that last week, right? And Israel is now in the aftermath of the war. We started speaking a little bit about the aftermath of the war last week in the context of all these captured territories and the whole conversation of land for peace. Hello, Debbie. How you doing? Feeling okay? Give me a thumbs up. All right. And I see Stuart's hand there, so that looks wonderful. Okay. Okay. And we're going to continue now focusing after the war. So before we jump into the topic here, I want to digress for a moment and kind of set up today's class. You know, think about a moment where you've had a certain expectation for something and the reality ended up totally clashing with what your expectation was, the way you thought it was going to turn out. I want you to try to imagine one of those times in your life where you've had that. We always have that. You know, here's an example. Imagine somebody who has a job, they work for somebody, and they kind of get this feeling that there's a lot of bad blood. The boss is really not happy with them. There's just this kind of friction. And this guy is sure that, you know, I don't have lots of time left in this company. And one day he gets a notice that his supervisor wants to meet with him to discuss productivity. His role in the company is like, oh, here it is. And it's happening in a week. He's already getting worked up. You know, his mind's already making all these plans. How much money do I have saved? How long will it take for me to get a new job? All these variables is already. And he shows up for the meeting. And what happens? They review his work and they say, we're going to be promoting you. And we're going to give you a raise. And he leaves that office and doesn't even know what to think. He's happy. He's also kicking himself in the leg. What I have to make myself all nervous about. He's not even sure what to make of what just happened. And this problem is called in psychology as cognitive dissonance. Let me put that up over here. Cognitive dissonance, where previous held beliefs and assumptions clash with the current reality. And we Jews are very good at worrying, so we especially identify with this problem a lot. Like, you know the Jewish joke? What does it say in a Jewish telegram? Start worrying, details to follow. That's the classic. All right. So, what do we humans do when we're experiencing cognitive dissonance? We usually don't really like cognitive dissonance. It really disturbs us. It mentally and psychologically really bothers us when things are not adding up. I thought this way, and then this is happening. So one of the things that we humans do, and we sometimes do it quite creatively, is what is called dissonance reduction. You got to take some of that dissonance and figure out how to actually smoothen out that wrinkle. How do we kind of make the narrative make sense? So what we'll do is, you know, maybe I was always right. And really what's happening now is, you know, like, for example, this is another great Jewish, you know, we make conspiracy theories in our heads. This is very, there's a whole genre of Jewish jokes in this. No, my boss is going to be firing me. They're just setting me up so that they could really sack me. You know, that's one way of kind of reducing the, smoothing out the narrative. Or you could say maybe what I thought was actually wrong. Maybe I was making it up. Maybe it's all in my head. Maybe something changed in the middle. Maybe both of them are true, something changed. So whenever there is cognitive dissonance, we humans run and we try utilizing the creativity of our minds to come up with some type of good rationalization of what is going on over here to make it all smooth. Okay, why are we talking about cognitive dissonance? Because post 6-Day War, there was a national and, in a certain way, global cognitive dissonance within the Jewish community. In a very short time, 6 days, barely enough time to even process what is happening, the situation on the ground changed absolutely dramatically, in an absolute way. Before the war, the Jewish people, the people in Israel, felt that they were possibly at the threshold of another Holocaust, God forbid. They were preparing national parks and converting them into new burial spaces, tens of thousands. They were creating tens of thousands of graves. They were expecting that type of slaughter to happen. There was talk about Israel's nuclear reactor to be blown up by the Egyptians. What was the mood? It was doom. It was gloom. That is what the Jewish people were feeling in the weeks before the war. Let's read text 2, and I actually want to point out the name. I don't always do this, but the name, the author of this text, is Michael Oren, who was a Knesset member, an Israeli ambassador, but he's also famously known in the context of the 6-Day War for his best-selling book. I'm pretty sure it's best-selling book, 6 Days of War, which is, I think, really the #1 book if you want to learn the story. Right? Am I right about that? I think Michael Oren's book is, right? A good one, not necessarily the #1.
I haven't read them all.
Okay, all right, okay. We're not going to give him that much credit so fast. But Michael Oren describes this. Let's read text 2. I'll begin on my right. I think last time I started on my left. So, Tom, go ahead, text 2, page 183, and we're going to begin.
Throughout the country, thousands were hurrying to dig trenches, build shelters, and fill sandbags. In Jerusalem in particular, schools were refitted as bomb shelters, and air raid drills were practiced daily. Most buses and virtually all taxis were mobilized and an emergency blood drive launched. An urgent request for surgeons in view of the tough conditions they must be physically fit and experienced was submitted to the Red Cross, and extra units of plasma ordered from abroad. Special committees were placed in charge of gathering essential foodstuffs, for replacing workers called to the front, for evacuating children to Europe. Upward of 14,000 hospital beds were ready, and antidotes stockpiled for poison gas victims, expected to arrive in waves of 200. Some 10,000 graves were dug. The sole bright spot in these otherwise morbid preparations was the unprecedented outpouring of sympathy from around the Jewish world. Yet these gestures did little to relieve the sense of approaching catastrophe. Of the Jews' abandonment, yet another Holocaust, what are you waiting for? Hannah Zemmer, deputy editor of the Daily Devar, accosted Prime Minister Levi Eshkol. He retorted with a description of Israel's international isolation, of the massive casualties it would suffer. But
I'll read this. Blut wird sich gießen wie Wasser. You can continue. He
concluded in Yiddish, blood will run like water. These were talks of widespread bombing of Israeli cities, of entire generations of soldiers being wiped out.
All right, so this is kind of giving us a little bit of a glimpse of the mood in Israel, what they were expecting for, what the anticipation was. Okay. Then within 6 very short days, Israel goes and doesn't just, get out of the mess. It's a total reversal. Israel goes and is now recognized as a force to be reckoned with. It's not just some small little pitty country. This is a real force. They've made tremendous gains, military, political gains, but also pride. It brought back pride and it put Israel on such a tremendous pedestal. Israel really went to start being like an empire. This is really what created the force of Israel. And the people in Israel and the Jewish people went kind of a little nuts. It was intoxicating, the feeling. And I want to read with you now the next text 3. And again, I want to point out the name to you, because I'm going to talk again about these names soon. We read before from Michael Oren. He wrote one book on Israel, and this is now Tom Segev, who wrote another book on Israel from a very different vantage point. Text 3, Tom Segev kind of describes to us the mood after the war. Jim, you want to go for it?
The sense of total doom had all but disappeared. History was about to begin again. Two popular jokes drive home the reversal of the mood. According to the first, told before the war, a sign hangs near the boarding gate at Lod Airport asking the last one in the country to turn off the lights. And the second, after the war, two officers are talking about how to spend their day. Let's conquer Cairo, one proposes. The other replies, but what will you do after lunch?
So there you go. That's the reversal that's going on over here. And this is what we're dealing with. A very large measure of national cognitive dissonance. People have to kind of start figuring out a way, how do we reconcile the expectation with this new unbelievable reality? We're going to watch another lesson video, and this is going to send us forward this is going to set us up for today's class. So here we go. And Shauna, can I ask you to get the lights? And here we go.
The Arab plan for June 1967 was straightforward. The destruction of Israel in the most absolute sense, meaning the capture of its every city and village, and the merciless massacre of every Jewish citizen. A catchy slogan bandied about by the leaders of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan was, "We will meet you for lunch in Tel Aviv." But after just 6 days of war, the forces of annihilation had been all but annihilated, while victorious Israeli forces were ready to deliver the lunch directly to the plates of the same Arab leaders in their respective capitals. The IDF had achieved their dream objectives of capturing the strategic areas of the Golan Heights, the Gaza coastal strip, and the Sinai Peninsula. Israel had freed its seaport from Egyptian blockade, and it had inadvertently captured the entire West Bank as well. Israeli forces were now in a position to storm the Arab capitals of Cairo, Damascus, and Amman. But the thought of entering Arab capitals frightened the Israeli political leadership, who were loath to awaken that great bear, the Soviet Union, that threatened to join the war on the Arab side. The same concern prompted the United States to urge Israel in the strongest possible terms to halt its advance. Israel obeyed. As it lowered its guns, Israel looked back and gasped. She had gone to war on June 5th with the primary hope of surviving the combined Arab threat at all costs against incredible odds. But she had more than survived. When she accepted a ceasefire on June 10th, her territory had more than tripled in size. She had expanded in all directions from an indefensible 8,000 square miles to a robust 26,000. She now embraced all of Jerusalem, almost all of biblical Israel, and many ancient and sacred Jewish cities and sites. Israel's abrupt reversal of fortune read like a page out of the Bible itself. Just a fortnight earlier, Israel had designated national parks as mass cemeteries. It had dug 10,000 graves in advance and made plans to evacuate Jewish children to Europe to escape the promised bloodbath in the streets of its cities. Fast forward 6 days, and the nightmare had failed to materialize. The country was awash with relief, but also with grief. Upwards of 750 IDF soldiers made the supreme sacrifice, and more than 4,000 lay wounded. The Israeli Air Force lost 46 of its 200 fighters. Israel was a small country with an enormous heart, and she bitterly mourned each lost soul. On the Arab side, the casualties were far higher. Approximately 15,000 Egyptians, 6,000 Jordanians, and 2,500 Syrians had been killed, roughly 23,000 lives in total. Every nation on earth gasped in astonishment as Israel slipped out of the Arab noose that had already began to tighten around her neck with relatively minimal losses and maximum territorial and military gains. the modern, well-equipped, and much vaunted Arab armies had been pulverized beyond recognition. The Arabs had lost Jerusalem, and the Jews had regained the site of their biblical temple. But most astonished of all were the citizens and leadership of Israel. They had best recognized the gravity of the danger they faced, and they were now first-hand witnesses to a staggering and swift reversal unprecedented in history. Israel and Jews around the world breathed a collective sigh of relief and celebrated the remarkable turn of events that would be forever known simply as the Six-Day War.
And with that, we have this concept, right? Cognitive dissonance. Before the war, they were preparing for disaster. After the war, not only did it happen, the total opposite, this unbelievable victory. And the driving question of today's class is going to be, how did Israel and how did Jews around the world rationalize this remarkable victory? How did they process it? So one answer is God. And we're going to frame it in the frame of cognitive dissonance. How did they reduce this dissonance? Everybody had to give some type of explanation. It's an important question to ask because it's not just a question about the Six-Day War. It's not just a historical question. Okay, so how did Jews answer? How did they reduce the dissonance in the days after the Six-Day War? By asking this question, we're really going to start digging into different understandings of Israel in general, different ideologies. And these different ideologies are still present, alive, playing themselves out. The tensions playing themselves out today in Israel as well as abroad. This is really going to be exploring in limited time, but exploring to the best of our ability, different perspectives on the land and on the war as well. As we're going to see as the class keeps on going, all these different opinions and ideologies and perspectives change the way politics is playing out in Israel. We're gonna, God willing, dig into all of that. But you cannot understand today the social fabric of Israel, the people of Israel, the Jews living in Israel, without answering this question. How did Jews process? What tools were employed to reduce this dissonance? That's our question for today. What we're going to do is we're going to go through four different groups. Okay, before we jump in, I need to make a little important note. First of all, welcome to everybody who I didn't get a chance to say hi to on Zoom. Those who came a little bit after we started the class, so good evening to all of you and welcome. Just by the way, for all those of you on Zoom, last week's class, I'm checking the recording after the class and I realized the mic kept on banging. And no one told me. Nancy, you got to tell me next time. Somebody has to let me know. For an hour and a half, you have to hear my lectern banging at it. Okay, someone, don't be shy. Just let me know. Unmute and say, Rabbi, something's wrong. You can just let me know that. Okay. So whenever we discuss different groups of people, we run the risk of labeling people, coming across as disagreeing with people, coming across as also kind of trying to stuff people into different boxes. I'm here, you're there, I believe this, you believe that. It's controversial to do. I don't think it's really such a Jewish thing to do. It's definitely not the Chabad thing to do. You know, the philosophy in Chabad is that we're all Jews. We go beyond all the labels, right? We're here to just study and embrace each other simply as Jews. So I want to be very clear that while I am going to get into lots of different positions, opinions, some of which I agree, some of which I don't, I'm going to try to share them objectively. And most importantly, whenever we discuss an opinion and ideology, let's separate people from beliefs. We're discussing beliefs here. And if a conclusion in this classroom is going to be that a certain opinion is wrong, okay, then it's wrong. It's never a personal attack on anybody, definitely not anybody here present, either in person or virtually. We're rather discussing ideas, right? So it's not about people, it's about ideas. But ultimately, You can never get down into letting people's beliefs define their very identity. Yeah. And our identity is simply as Jews. So you got that? So with that introduction, let us start going through 4 different camps. The first camp of how to rationalize, how to understand what happened over here is, and this is the most obvious one, group 1 says there was divine intervention. The doom was correct. It's true. It was very scary. We weren't exaggerating. That was all truth. But what happened in between? What brought about this victory? This was because God, in his infinite kindness and love for the Jewish people, intervened and brought the Jewish people salvation. And especially in the few days after the war, everybody in Israel had this sentiment. This is definitely, I can pretty certainly say, this was the most common response. This was the finger of God. That's what it said in the newspaper, the Yediot Achronot, which is a newspaper, or it's online, which is still around until today. It was a daily afternoon newspaper in Israel. Their editorial right after the war was, the headline said, they quoted the verse from the Torah, from Exodus, from the story of the Exodus. This is the finger of God. As they said, it's the finger of God. How else could you explain it? This is what they said. Like the story goes, somebody asked an Israeli general, how did Israel win the war? So he says, I'll tell you. There's a natural answer and there's a supernatural answer. The natural answer is that God did a miracle. The supernatural answer is that we had a good army. Understand? Very deep line. Saying that this was a miracle makes a lot more sense than saying we had it all figured out. We had nothing figured out. It was real miracles, and I want to get into that in a moment. But in the aftermath, to go into some specifics, in the aftermath, in the few days and weeks and months, the euphoria, the experience was. I'm going to read this with you. This is actually an important quote. This is the IDF general. He was a commander of the paratroopers, one of the brigades that took Jerusalem. His name was Raphael, but Raphel, that's what he was known. Raphel Eitan. Apparently, someone in heaven was watching over us. Every unintended action they took and every unintended action that we took always turned to our advantage. And this was the feeling in Israel, and this led to a widespread feeling in Israel, a strong reawakening. Number one, post 6-Day War, there's tremendous spiritual awakening. Just a few days after the war, in the holiday of Shavuot, they right away knocked down all the houses in front of the Kotel. As you saw in the video, the original Kotel Plaza was just a tiny little alleyway. It wasn't a plaza. It was never meant for people to go there. Right away, they cleared it. It was still under construction. 200,000 Jews came for Shavuot. It was unheard of to have that number of people showing up on one day to the Kotel, and they all cried and they all celebrated together. If I'm not mistaken, some of the videos we saw before, you see throngs of people walking through the streets of Jerusalem. That was taken on the holiday of Shavuot. That's what you see. So what you have is, there was a widespread religious awakening. It had a tremendous effect. Historically, they say that the Baal Teshuvah movement of the 60s really started post 6-Day War. Everybody felt there's a God, God's watching over the Jewish people, and everybody wanted to connect. As one of the soldiers said, I think I mentioned this in one of the earlier classes, during the war, everybody in Israel became religious. Everybody was, after the war, maybe things changed, but right then we were all religious. Everybody believed, everybody knew that God's helping us. It wasn't even a question. It was part of life there. So that's the first thing, the Baal Teshuvah movement. As well, the whole concept of Aliyah, the Western Aliyah, Jews picking up and moving to Israel really started after the 6-Day War. And another very important and significant effect that the war had was an increased sense of Jewish pride around the world, especially in the former Soviet Union. It was very interesting that the Russians, the communists, they blocked all news reports coming out of Israel. They didn't want anybody to know that Israel was winning. But the only radio station they did not block was Kol Yisrael, because it was in Hebrew. It wasn't in Russian, it wasn't in English. So all the Jews actually were able to listen to Israeli radio the entire time. It wasn't blocked. And it emboldened the refuseniks, it emboldened the Jews. The Jews stuck in Russia all of a sudden felt we're one with the Jewish people. We share a common fate, and God is watching over us, and we could win. And even the great bear, right? Even this great mighty power, the USSR, who was really the big instigator behind the whole war, even they failed. Even they couldn't win. So it really inspired them in such a tremendous way. This is Nathan Sharansky. For those of you who recognize him, and he says the 6-Day War is really what rejuvenated them. It inspired them in a tremendous way. So this is the first way, first model of how Jews looked at the war. How did they reduce the dissonance? Very simple. Before the war, there was danger and doom and thoughts of another Holocaust, God forbid. That was true. How did the victory happen? Something came in and ruined the whole narrative, put a monkey wrench in the whole narrative. This is how it goes. Okay, I'm going to talk about the second camp in a moment. Let's not get there yet. But many were apprehensive, especially when the euphoria wore off in Israel, and said, no, I'm not so sure if there were really miracles there. Miracles? What miracles? Did any seas split? Right? When the Jewish people, biblically, entered the land of Israel, I'm sure you know the story. They came with Joshua to conquer. And what did Joshua do to conquer the city of Jericho? They blew shofar, and the walls fell down. I don't know, last time I tried to show them shofar, no walls fell down. It's not right, that's a miracle. You see, in Jewish tradition, there's an understanding that there's two different types of miracles. I want to take a look in your books. Take a look over here at page 186. Because I think this is an important point to make over here. You know, there's really two different definitions of miracles, and even the online Oxford Dictionary. What's the difference between the print Oxford Dictionary and the online Oxford Dictionary? All right, but the online Oxford Dictionary, this is how it describes miracles. There's two different descriptions. One is, the first definition, is an extraordinary and welcome event that is not explicable by natural or scientific laws and is therefore attributed to a divine agency. That's one. Sounds right? That's a miracle. Right? What's number two? A remarkable event or development that brings very welcome consequences. What's the difference?
Where's God?
Yeah,
What's the difference between one and two?
one has the divine presence.
One is clearly divine, and two is what?
Happenstance.
Two is happenstance, or arguably happenstance, right? One type of miracle is undeniable. If you see a sea splitting, okay, you know, you could try to come up with scientific reasons, but at the end of the day, if you see a sea splitting, what is that? That's a miracle. And there are certain types of miracles, which is number two in the Oxford Dictionary. It's remarkable. It doesn't shatter the laws of physics, but it maybe shatters the laws of probabilities. You know, that's what it is. In the Jewish tradition, God does both types of miracles. One type of miracle is called a miracle that totally overrides nature. And then there's another type of miracle which is within nature. God is a little bit more incognito. You can't look back and say that a law of nature was broken here. But it's remarkable. Something special happened. You could call it luck. You could say things came in the right time, in the right moment, it all fell into place. You could discount it and say, you know what, it wasn't a miracle. There's luck or happenstance. It just happened. There's luck. Sometimes luck is this way, sometimes luck goes that way. But in Judaism, there's a very key idea. God does both types of miracles. There are revealed miracles and there are natural miracles. Natural miracles can be the smallest things. The smallest things. The difference is, one, according to the Oxford Dictionary, the revealed miracles are number one, you cannot attribute it to nature, to the laws of science, and you have to say this was a a divine agency, a divine agent. It was divine. The hidden miracles, the miracles within nature, those are a little bit more hidden. They don't break nature. They don't break the laws of science, of physics. But according to Judaism, these are still miracles. And this was a Jewish understanding. This is how Jews felt. God didn't necessarily split seas. But as we started learning of the events of the war and just how much luck and how much happenstance came together to bring about this remarkable victory, people started saying, you know what? This is too improbable. This is too good to be true. This was the hand of God. And this was the understanding of it. Let's go through a few of the small miracles that happened during the war. Many people didn't even realize this was happening. And these small miracles are what attributed to the ultimate victory. And this is where people start noticing, starting to see a pattern, a fingerprint trace, or identifying God's fingerprints in the story. So let's begin with one text 6. And this is one fascinating miracle that really helped contribute to the war. And this is that in the immediate days before the war began, the Egyptian army changed all the commanders at the Sinai front. All the old commanders, which understood what was happening, knew the terrain, they were all sent somewhere else. And Israel didn't even know about this. We don't even know why. This is called a miracle. Text 6, page 188. Read by you, Leah? Yeah. You got a big reading. You're okay?
I think I can do it.
Go for it. Okay. Text 6.
During the 1967 war, the Egyptian Army's command and control system down to division and brigade level broke down. The seeds of this problem were planted in the 3 weeks before the outbreak of hostilities. Earlier in 1966, the Egyptians developed a new plan for the defense of the Sinai called
Kahir,
the Victor. Plan Kahir placed control of combat forces in the Sinai under a field army commander directly responsible for GHQ, General Headquarters, in Cairo. But on 15th of May, for reasons that still remain unclear, the Egyptian High Command surprised its senior officers with the sudden creation of a front command and the appointment of General Abdel Bosen Kamal Mutagu to head it.
You never met someone named Abdel Mohsen Kamal Mortagi?
It's been a while.
It's been a while.
Been a
Okay.
while.
All right.
Mortagu, as the new front commander, would be plagued by a number of problems. Although a competent soldier, he had been commanding the Egyptian expeditionary force in Yemen and lacked intimate knowledge of the operational plan for Sinai. Furthermore, as a front commander in Sinai, he would receive a high degree of responsibility without the commensurate authority to carry out his mission. Finally, Mortagu arrived at his command post in the Sinai near Bir al-Tamada on the 29th of May. Only a week before the war, and with a small staff of 20 officers, the Egyptian command and control system was further undermined. The High Command replaced all 12 division commanders and chiefs of staff, and a week or two after the creation of the front command. Then the confusion seeped down to the brigades and lower.
Israel did not even know about this when they went out to fight the Egyptians in the Sinai. And the Egyptians had over double the amount of troops as the Israelis had. If I have the numbers correct, the Egyptians had 100,000 troops in the Sinai. Israel barely put together 45,000. That's what they went out to. And the fact that the Egyptians themselves didn't have a proper command totally took the Israelis by surprise. And of course, to their advantage, the Israelis rolled in, experienced very little resistance, and within no time, not within days, within hours, the entire Egyptian army officially started retreating. And it's unbelievable because every army has a retreat plan. There's a plan how to retreat. You do it in an orderly fashion. And the Egyptian army just fell apart. No orderly retreat. It was crazy. You read about it. It actually sounds ridiculous. It sounds very incompetent. There was a whole traffic jam of Egyptians trying to leave. And the Israelis just had a very easy job of just destroying the entire army. And all the soldiers abandoned their vehicles, and the Israelis went and just bombed every single last truck and Jeep, and it was crazy. This is something you look back at, and you're like, you know what? This is one little thing. Could you say it's nature? Of course it's nature. Every army can make mistakes. But when you start piecing together all these little things, you start seeing a pattern. This concept of the Egyptian army running away, fleeing before they even put up a real fight, was something that was very inspiring from a miraculous perspective. And it was very reminiscent of two verses in the Torah, which makes it sound very, very, very biblical. Let's read these two verses. Mary, you want to read them? Text 7a and 7b. And this is literally the Bible describing what's happening over here. Go ahead.
You will pursue your enemies, and they will fall before you by sword. 5 of you will pursue 100 of your foes, and 100 of you will pursue 10,000.
That's one verse. Okay, very good. Continue.
God will cause your enemies who rise up against you to be defeated before you. They will come out against you from one direction, but they will flee from you in 7 directions.
The second verse especially. They will come at you from one direction, but flee in 7 directions. Total disarray. They don't even know where they're going. That's exactly what happened in Sinai in a very powerful way. That's one small little miracle. Okay, the commanders were unfamiliar with the terrain, and it made the entire assault pretty easy for the Israeli army. Another miracle, and again, you could say again, this is chance, but this is a tremendous small little detail of the story. The most important part of the whole war was that Israel was able to successfully mount a surprise attack on the first morning of the war and destroy the entire Egyptian Air Force, right? As we spoke about in length in the second class. Here's the fascinating thing. The Jordanians actually picked up on their radars all the Israeli jets. It's a fact. All the Israeli jets. And in Jordan, they knew the war just started. And guess what they did? They right away radioed to Cairo. Heads up, the planes are coming. The war has begun. And for some reason, Egyptians just never got that message. Why not? What went wrong there? So after the war, they started studying documents. And this is what Michael Oren found in his book. Let's read text 8, page 191. Unbelievable little piece of information over here. Little nugget here.
Supplied by Britain, Jordan's radar facility at Ajalon, near Jerash, was one of the most sophisticated in the Middle East. At 8:15 a.m., the station's screens were suddenly studded with blips. Though the Jordanians had grown accustomed to large numbers of Israeli aircraft heading out to sea, the density of the concentration was unprecedented. The officer on duty radioed in Greek, Anab in Arabic, prearranged code for war to Jordanian General Riyadh's headquarters in Amman. Riyadh in turn relayed the information to Egyptian Defense Minister Shams Badran in Cairo, and there it remained undecipherable. The Egyptians had changed their encoding frequencies the previous day, but without updating the Jordanians. Egyptian Air Force intelligence also reported extensively on the Israeli attack, but field officers at Supreme Headquarters devoted to Field Marshal Abdel Hakim Amir and distrustful of Nasser's loyalists in the Air Force ignored them.
The Egyptians know about it for 2 hours, and the Egyptians changed their encoding frequencies the previous day, and therefore, yesterday, they would have understood what the Jordanians are telling them. And today they look at their little book that says what the codes are and they have no clue what it says. It's just unbelievable. And that is the day that Israel mounts the attack. Another small little nugget. During the very morning that Israel mounted the surprise attack, and Israel did not know any of this. This is all what we can call chance. One of the Egyptian generals went up by ear to go and get and observe all the formations in the Sinai Desert. They're preparing for war. And he said that while he's up in the air, nobody could shoot in the sky because he didn't want his plane to be taken down. Again, Israel did not know about this. While he's up in the sky, that's exactly when the surprise attack begins, and all the Egyptians are too scared to shoot at the planes. The ones that did were sure they're going to be fired and hanged. They did it anyways. All of these things, small things. I also read one last small nugget. It's just so fascinating. When the Israeli army began fighting the Jordanians in Jerusalem, they did it at night. The attack began at night. problem is that they had no plans. The Israeli army just simply did not have plans to fight the Jordanians in Jerusalem. They didn't have any maps, there was no strategy, and none of the soldiers knew this area because they've never been there in 20 years. Most of the soldiers were very, very young, and they've never been in Jordan. They've never been in East Jerusalem. So they're in the middle of the night. They have no clue where their fellow soldiers are. They don't know where they're literally shooting in the dark. And unfortunately, there was a nice amount of friendly fire, unfortunately. But they were literally just guessing. Middle of the night, shooting guns, shooting mortars. And the Israeli soldiers said the next morning, they look at what they just did. And every single time they shot, they shelled, it was a bullseye. It was like unbelievable. He says, we had no clue what we were doing. We didn't know if we were shooting at our men. We just did it. We just fought a whole night. All these things come together, and as we just saw before, the commander said, everything we did unintentionally was to our benefit. Everything they did unintentionally was also to our benefit, hurt them. The point is, you put all these details together, and we have a very strong case, which is a very inspiring case. And this is how the Jewish people felt. This was the prevailing sense after the war. Something miraculous just happened. We have just experienced the miracle. And Jews celebrated that. And Jews felt the confidence of that. It was a very empowering message. Okay, that's group number one. Until today, from what I hear, many of us naturally feel this exact same way. This was a miracle. And although I said I want to try to present the four camps, the four groups objectively, I will subjectively say I very much identify with this camp. Okay. But now let's move on to group number two. Group number two is a very funny group. Group number two did begin right after the war, but it especially became a kind of revisionist, historical revisionist group after the war, and became a lot more prevalent in more recent times. Camp number two says there was no miracle. No miracle. So how do you reduce the dissonance? Well, they say, look, all that fear, all that terror that everybody felt before the war was one big exaggeration and one big fear-mongering. No Holocaust. The Arabs weren't really that good. We had much better intelligence. Even America after the war told Israel, you know why we didn't step in to help you before the war? Because our intelligence felt, we came to the conclusion on our own that you'll be able to win the war within a few days. Which is like, which is crazy. It was a slap in the face, like, oh, really? After the war, you tell us that you came, yeah, we knew you could win it in 6 days. Maybe a few more days, but yeah, we knew that. So this group says, no miracles, and you were all wrong in your understanding and your assessment of the situation before the war. This is their understanding. Now, who was saying this? People who were saying this were either the people who were professed atheists. They don't want to bring God into the picture. That's another form of cognitive dissonance, right? If I don't believe in God and all of a sudden this is God, then I've got no problems on my hands. They just say, no God, no danger, no problem. You're all just making yourselves mashiga. Okay, I'll get out of your way. Also the people who were anti-Israel. People who were anti-Israel felt that Israel was being immoral. So it's very convenient for them to say no miracles, and the opposite. Israel was being the aggressor. And this is this new form of revisionism, and I'm saying that because that's really the consensus out there. The academic consensus is that this is historical revisionism. Come and say, nah, the Arabs never even really wanted to attack. Israel provoked the Arabs. Israel was the aggressor, and all these types of things, all in order to be able to say there's no miracle, God didn't do anything, because once we get God involved in the whole picture, then that challenges the whole way we think. Okay, Moshe Dayan is up here in this picture here because he wasn't fully, but he was somebody who also, started dancing around after the war. He was very inspired after the war. He actually was the one who named the war the 6-Day War. He named it after the 6 days of creation, such a powerful message. 6 days we work, on the 7th day we rest. He felt it was like a biblical act. But even he, really got uncomfortable with the whole idea of too much God in the picture, and really we're just an inferior army. And you could, in a certain way, say that it was his.
Rabbi Dubov,
Yes.
the writing underneath on those pictures, we really can't see well. So could you read it to us when you're there?
Okay. It says exaggeration and fear mongering. The victory was due to Israel's superior intelligence and military preparedness. That's what it says there. So Moshe Dayan said, you know what? It was only because we were a better army, and he was a little bit too overly confident. And many people blame him for the fact that Israel did not take the threat a few years later of the Yom Kippur War seriously. So, he's maybe a little bit jumping back and forth between group one and group two. But this is especially in the modern age where the world is becoming more and more anti-Israel. And many Jews, unfortunately, are starting to become anti-Israel as well. They don't want to say it's miraculous. They just said, you know what, the whole thing was one big, Israel was just getting too excited and they wanted to try to get sympathy from everybody. So they made it as if this was a bigger deal than it really was. Let's read text 9 from Michael Oren. And Michael Oren here takes issue with Tom Segev. We read about Tom Segev before. Tom Segev is one of the biggest authors in Israel who is proposing this type of historical revisionism. It wasn't really a big deal. So let's read a little bit about this phenomenon in text 9, and then we'll move on to our next group. Richard, you're up.
The biggest myth going is that somehow there was not a real and immediate Arab threat, that somehow Israel could have negotiated itself outside the crisis of 1967, and that it wasn't facing an existential threat or facing any threat at all, said Michael Oren, who is a senior fellow at the Adelson Institute for Strategic Studies at Jerusalem Shalom Center and author of 6 Days of War, June 1967. He noted that this was the premise of Tom Segev's book in 1967, Israel, the War, and the Year That Transformed the Middle East. What's remarkable is that all the people alleging this, not one of them is working from Arabic sources. It's quite extraordinary when you think about it. It's almost as if Israel were living in a universe by itself. It's a deeply solipsistic approach to Middle East history. What's behind the myth, Oren argued, is a more pervasive, ongoing effort to show that Israel bears the bulk, if not the sole responsibility for decades of conflict in the Arab world, and that the Arabs are the aggrieved party. It's an attempt to show that Israel basically planned the Six-Day War in advance, knowing that it was going to expand territorially. My position is that it was just the opposite. Israel was taken aback by the crisis, unprepared for it, and panicked, believing it had faced a true existential threat and did not plan to expand territory. It did everything it could to keep Jordan and Syria out of the war. My reading of the Arabic documents showed that the Arabs had real plans to attack and destroy the state of Israel.
All right, so this is camp number 2, which simply says, keep God out of it. The whole thing was blown over. No real danger. You went to war, you've done your thing. Maybe you're even the aggressors, and move on with life. That's group number 2. Okay. Group number 3. All right. I'm taking a deep breath because it's uncomfortable to speak about group number 3. And it's even a little bit upsetting to discuss it.
I understand text 9, this is a refutation.
This is a bit of refutation, yeah, that's right. But group number 3 is uncomfortable to discuss, but I think we have to discuss it. It wouldn't be right to, because it's a very, very misunderstood understanding of a group of people, their understanding of the war, and at large their understanding about Israel. And it's on the spectrum of different understandings of the war. So let's do it. I do want to separate myself. I do not personally adhere to these beliefs, but I think it will actually be quite an educational experience to understand a little bit what these beliefs are. Group number 3, that's that whole introduction. Who's group number 3? Group number 3 are the religious anti-Zionists. Okay. Now, in the media, you'll see most about the religious anti-Zionists who go meet with Iran. No, okay. that's really fringe. That's like, I'm not even talking about them. They're out of the spectrum. You know, somebody who's going and meeting the people who want to kill other Jews. We're not even talking about those people. But there's religious anti-Zionists who even live in Israel, who are very anti-Zionists. They don't support the government at all. They maybe don't even vote in, for sure, not national elections. They're you know, they live in Israel, but they're totally anti the government, anti-Zionists. The largest group of these people are the Satmar Hasidic group. The Satmar group was a Hungarian Hasidic group, which was mainly centered in New York, in Williamsburg after the war. And their leader, his name is Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum of Satmar. He was especially known to be staunchly, religiously anti-Zionists. What he did was he took an idea, or maybe two ideas, which at a certain degree you could say the idea is a valid point. But like all extremism, all forms of extremism, you take an idea and you run a little bit too far with it, right? You become no nuance and you just take something and you just go all the way to the end with it, which is what this group does. How did group number 3 think about the war? The religious anti-Zionists, what they said was, I'll read the text with you right now. It's quite shocking. What he said was, there were miracles, but not by God. This was intercession by unholy powers, the Satan. Group number 3 says, you want to know how Israel got out of this mess? This was unholy satanic forces. I'm not making this up, all right? They said the supernatural victory was the doing of the power of unholiness. Let's read this text. Straight from the writings of Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum. In fact, my father told me that when he was growing up in Crown Heights, he remembers the war, and in the community of Crown Heights, he was Chabad, and there were also some Satmar Hasidim who lived in Crown Heights. And you know, everybody was listening to the radio those days. Everyone wanted to know what's happening in the war. 1-2 days into the war, all of a sudden, his Satmar neighbors tell him, our Rebbe told us that we're not allowed to follow the war anymore. We're out. Why was it uncomfortable for them? So let's read text 12, and then we'll talk about their form of cognitive dissonance and what their position is, because I think it actually is an educational thing. You know, we always hear about religious people, anti-Israel, what's their point? Whether you agree with them or don't agree with them, what's their point at least? That doesn't get explained much. So we'll discuss that. Text 12, Rick, right? Chuck, sorry. Chuck, text 12.
One should avoid, to the degree possible, recounting miracles performed by Satan. Such discussion causes people to err and misguides those who lack comprehension, leading them to ascribe significance to the events. Even if in fact the victory was a supernatural phenomenon, it is necessary to conceal this fact and portray the events as natural. Sadly, today the opposite is occurring. People are discussing and publicizing non-existent imaginary miracles with the sole objective of deceiving the public.
So he says, don't talk about it, don't even discuss the miracles. The Satmar group would be totally against even having this course, because they see this whole thing as an act, as a ploy by the Satan to help the evil Zionists. Okay, this is right straight out of the horse's mouth, not me saying it. Okay, now let's be very, very clear. Within the Orthodox community, the vast majority does not adhere to these opinions. But this is a minority, but a significant group. The religious anti-Zionists, they do not serve in the IDF, or as I mentioned, they do not take part in elections. They will not take part of any political process in Israel. They reject absolutely the authority of the government, established, of course, the Zionist government in Israel.
Why do they live in Israel?
Why do they live in Israel? It's a very good question. Well, many of them historically live there, or they have a community there, but in their minds, like, you know, we live here. They don't take any government funds. They don't take any government assistance for their schools, for their families. No, we don't want any social welfare programs. No, this is the way they think.
Find a better example, cognitive dissonance.
And that, yeah. So they have a lot of cognitive dissonance. The war itself is cognitive dissonance. One second. Something so miraculously happened, but then who did it? Right. We're anti-Zionist, but a miracle just happened. God couldn't do it. Right? Because
we're anti-Zionist, we're convinced we're right.
exactly. So where are they coming from? Why are they so anti-Zionist? So let's go through, there's two reasons why historically they are anti-Zionist. Now, both of these reasons, I'll mention again, both of these reasons are interesting points and valid points, which means on the level of ideas, they have a point. And the Orthodox world contends with these points. But to take it to an extreme, that is where they are unique in what they do. And in fact, you should just know, for those of you who know a little bit of history, in the 60s and the 70s, there was a lot of friction between the Satmar group and Chabad. And it all actually started right after the 6-Day War. Because Chabad went out very vocally, we're going to see soon what the Rebbe said, in support of Israel, saying that it was an absolute miracle. And they said, if Chabad's saying that, we're out. And that's when they became very anti-Chabad. So this is what they say. Where does the religious opposition to Zionism come from? Two reasons. Number one, a little bit of Talmud. Text 10, page 194. Jeff, would you like to read?
I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, that you neither awaken nor arouse the love until it is desirous. In this verse, God imposes an oath upon the Jews that they not retake the land of Israel by force.
It's a very interesting piece of Talmud. The Talmud discusses that after the Jews were expelled from the land of Israel, after the Roman conquest of Judea, the Talmud says that God made an oath with the Jewish people. In fact, 3 oaths. 3 oaths. One of the oaths were, do not arouse the love until it is desirous. Where God says, don't force your way back into Israel. I'll let you know when it's time to come back. This is a piece of Talmud. It's a little bit cryptic. What does it mean? Who exactly did God make this oath with? Was it something that really every single Jew experienced? What are the limitations of this oath? Does it literally mean not let it go touch the land of Israel? It doesn't mean that. Historically, Jews always went to live in the land of Israel, as we spoke about in lesson 1. So what are the limitations of this oath? When does it apply? When does it not apply? But this group number 3, the religious anti-Zionists, take it to a full extreme. You're not allowed to touch Israel. You're not allowed to ever do anything of force in the land of Israel. So what does this opinion say? Group number 3, the entire Zionist movement is a violation of this oath. We are not allowed to go and push our way back into Israel. So this is what made them anti-Zionist in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, right? Even before we came to the land, when it was still a movement, an ideological movement back in Europe. Until today, they look at the entire establishment of the state of Israel as one big violation of this piece of Talmud. And this is one of the religious reasons why there are religious anti-Zionists. Okay. Now, again, they take this to a very strong extreme. Most Orthodox Jews will say, well, actually, we have to understand the limitations of this oath. Historically, Jews have always lived in Israel. In fact, there are some Satmar, as I said, right? There's a lot of religious anti-Zionists in Israel itself. So there's a lot of gray zone in this, in the way to understand this piece of Talmud, and there's a lot of answers of how to explain why the existence of the state of Israel is not so problematic for this oath. Number one, you could say we got permission from the world to be in Israel. This oath says, do not retake the land of Israel by force. We didn't take the land of Israel by force. We got permission from the UN, the Balfour Declaration, right? This is where the international legal permission comes in. Also, all the wars, which is where Israel did use aggression, were not wars of conquest. They were wars of defense. The War of Independence was not a war started by Israel. It was a war started by the Arab neighbors. So most of orthodoxy, Jewish orthodoxy, religious Jews, look at this piece of Talmud and say, practically speaking, the modern state of Israel is not in violation of this oath. Or maybe it is, but not to such a strong degree. Or maybe de facto it's not such a big problem. We already have it, or whatever. But this group number 3 takes it to an absolute extreme. This is anti-God, anti-Torah, anti-religious, bad all the way through. We don't want to have anything to do with the modern state of Israel. Then there's another argument. Or another reason. Right? So this is the first reason. Talmud says the Jewish people may not retake the land of Israel by force, and therefore they are categorically against the land of Israel. And by the way, Satmar Hasidim will not go to the Kotel, will not go to the cave of Machpelah. They will not visit any of the holy places in Israel. They were taken by force. They were not allowed to. It's forbidden to go there. Okay. This is right. This is the definition of taking one idea and just at least consistent. At least there's consistency. That's right. They got that. Okay, here's the next one. You know, today, when you hear the word Zionism, somebody says, I'm a Zionist, or somebody says, I'm anti-Zionist. What does Zionism mean? Support Israel. Right? Today, it's actually a very simple definition. Zionism means you support Israel. You're a Zionist means you support Israel. Anti-Zionist in today's world means you don't support Israel. But if you actually go back to the history of what Zionism means, Zionism is really a lot more than just supporting or not supporting the land of Israel, the right of Israel to self-govern, self-determination. But Zionism was really an ideology back in the day. We're talking about in the 1800s, the early 1900s. Before it became a practical movement of establishing a Jewish government in the land of Israel, it was an ideology. It was a nationalist ideology. And the ideology was very anti-religious, which is why, historically speaking, most Orthodox Jews before World War II were adamantly anti-Zionist. Then Zionism didn't have anything to do with the land of Israel, meaning it was part of the ideology. It was more about nationalism. And I want to read a little bit with you, not to put anybody down, but just to kind of get a little bit of a feeler of what the ideology of Zionism was, and to understand why there was a lot of anti-Zionism in the religious circles, which was the vast majority of Jews in Eastern Europe, right, in the early 1900s, late 1800s. This was not a minority. Most Jews were against it. And in fact, Zionism was very much about creating youth movements to try to pull in Orthodox Jews to leave Orthodox Judaism, not Orthodox Judaism, but to leave religious Judaism and start identifying with this new religion. Really was like a replacement called Zionism. So let's read three things over here. And again, not to put anybody down, but to kind of understand what Zionism meant in its original mutation, and then to understand why there was a lot of bad blood feelings there. So Alan, text 11a from Max Mandelstam. He was a Zionist writer, I know. These were names today, you don't necessarily recognize all these names, but these were the big heavy hitters of the Zionist movement back in the day. So text 11a.
I have concluded that those Jews who are not Zionists, at least in their minds and hearts, are not Jews. To be a Zionist is to be a Jew. There are many citizens of the world who are considered Jewish, who observe the commandments, such as circumcision, tzitzit, and tefillin, who are scrupulous regarding ritual slaughter, pray at the proper times, and fast on Jewish fast days. But in a national sense, these people have the right to the title Jew as much as I can rightfully identify myself as Chinese, were I to choose to abide by Chinese law.
Now, this is a very extreme statement. Judaism has nothing to do with Judaism anymore. Judaism is a belief of Zionism. If you believe in Zionism, you're a Jew. If not, I don't care what you look like, I don't care what you do, you're not Jewish. So Zionism really came out and said, we are a brand new version of Judaism, and there's no middle ground. So what happens to people who don't agree with this? Become very anti it. And it became a very strong cultural war for 50, 60, 70 years. There's a whole piece of history to this, of the early genesis of the Zionist movement. And this is really why there was a lot of anti-Zionist sentiment, which again, not anti-Israel, anti-Zionist ideology, right? This is a whole ideology in itself. So that's one statement here from Max Mandelstam. To be a Zionist is to be a Jew, to the exclusion of anything else. So Max Mandelstam, for me, he looks Chinese. I know. I'm like, you know what? That's funny you say that. Coincidence, huh? Okay. Text 11b, next one from Nachman Sirkin. Toby, go ahead.
This new Zionist Judaism stands in complete contrast to the Judaism of the Middle Ages, religious Judaism, and exilic Judaism. In fact, Zionism uproots religious Judaism in a stronger and more fundamental manner than does the Reform movement and assimilation. These uprooted Judaism in an artificial way, causing complete assimilation or allowing for the reemergence of Talmudic and religious Judaism in a later period. Zionism, on the other hand, fundamentally uproots Judaism by creating new standards of Judaism and creating new Jewish spiritual values. This will successfully eradicate religious Judaism to the point that it will never again re-emerge.
See what's going on here? So the early Zionist thinkers say reform didn't go far enough. Reform is still letting Judaism rebound. No, we want to go all the way. And we're going to be successful, that the old traditional Judaism is going to be forgotten to never come back again. Zionism uproots religious Judaism. Okay? And one last quote, which is not in your books, but I'll read it to you, from David Ben-Gurion. David Ben-Gurion, he believed this. He had a lot of Zionist ideology, but he was also very pragmatic as a leader, which is why, and he understood that the Orthodox do have to have a voice in the Knesset and have to be, so he brought them in on a pragmatic way. But for to understand David Ben-Gurion's ideology, this is what he writes. You ready for this? The Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, is a product of our nation's life in the exile. It was produced in the exile, in conditions of exile. A nation in the process of fulfilling its every task, physically and spiritually, must compose a new Shulchan, a new code. And our nation's intellectuals are required, in my opinion, to fulfill their responsibility in this. So again, what's the theme? Out with the old, in with the new. Old Judaism, absolutely out. It was even a fight in general. There was a small faction within the Zionist movement that said, no, tradition is still very, very important. Still got to keep some tradition. Don't throw it all out. We need a little bit there. But most Zionists said, out with everything. And this was David Ben-Gurion. He said this. Okay. Now, why am I'm not here to come down hard and to try to, this is why historically religious Jews were anti-Zionist. The history of European Jewry was anybody who was religious was naturally anti-Zionist. It was a very exciting movement. It was progressive, so the youth really gravitated to it. It's part of the stories. A lot of youth got caught into it. But the established Jewish communities were very, very against it for this exact reason.
Sephardic and Ashkenazi?
Zionism is Ashkenazi. The Sephardim never even heard about it.
Okay.
Which was a very big culture shock when Israel airlifted the Yemenite Jews.
I was thinking of the
Yemenite. And there's a whole history to that.
The Ethiopian Jews.
Right, they had no clue what hit them. And they've never heard of, in general, it's a whole history for itself, the split between the Sephardim and the Ashkenazim. It's definitely a big course, yeah. Okay, this is the reason, and this is really the genesis of religious anti-Zionism. This group, the religious anti-Zionists, never gave up on their anti-Zionism. They said this is the foundation that modern Israel is built upon. It's evil. We have nothing to do with it for this reason. Again, they have a point, right? We can appreciate their point. So it's an ideology that goes totally against their religion, but it's a point taken all the way to the extreme. And for this reason, you can't support Israel. For this reason, you can't celebrate when Israel defends itself and millions of Jews don't die. No, we don't want any of that. You understand? This is where there's zero nuance in their understanding. And coming back to the war, what they say is it's impossible that God would perform miracles for such horrible sinners, the Zionists. So who did these miracles, if there were miracles at all? Must have been Satan. Understand? This, I'm just, you don't get it. Okay, it's okay.
No, I get it.
You get it.
I'm sitting here thinking what I would say to them.
You're right.
You continue to live in a place that
right.
is protected.
So let's even talk about the ones in New York. But okay. So again, so at least somebody who said this, they're very consistent. They're very consistent. They said we're never reevaluating. We are anti these people. There's no new considerations to bring in, and that's it. Yeah, very much my mind is made up. Now, what do the rest of the religious world say? Most of the rest of the religious world says, okay, you have a point. The early Zionists were bad people. Okay, granted, no problem. But the facts on the ground are today is that there are millions of Jews living in the land of Israel. This is their government. We have to support them. This is our holy land. You don't have to like how we got there, but we're there. So it's a little bit more of a pragmatic approach. And these people would say, the religious anti-Zionists just go out and say, no, we're not, we're not interested. It was built on an evil foundation. We are never reevaluated.
They still live there.
Some live there. But again, they live there like in isolation. We don't want to know of the government. We don't vote. We don't take any of their money. But they pay their bills. So, that's okay.
What's that word there on the far right-hand side?
We must compose a new Shulchan Aruch, which means a code of Jewish law. Okay, we're done. Okay, if anybody feels a bit tense, you could breathe out a little bit. This is group number 3. Group number 4, which is, again, a religious minority, but on the total opposite side. Let's actually review it first. You ready? Group number 1 says divine intervention. There were miracles happening here. God's protecting the Jewish people. This is a pretty simple and easy, straightforward account. Group number 2 says the whole thing was exaggeration, no miracles, no problems to begin with, no dissonance. It was never a problem, and you won because it was never really that much of a big problem. Group number 3, which is what we just discussed, the religious anti-Zionists, say this is an evil edifice. God could not have been the one to do anything here. If there were any miracles, it was Satan, and it couldn't have been anything else. Let's now move on to one more group, which is the religious Zionism. Religious pro-Zionists. Exact opposite. Religious, but very pro-Zionist in a very strong Zionistic way. And again, Zionism over here doesn't just mean they support Israel, it means they're very pro-ideology, even from the beginning. And what they say, this group says, is that the entire Zionist movement, every single war, and every single, and especially the establishment of the state of Israel, was not just something in the best interest of Jewish security, it wasn't just something to help the Jewish people. What they say is it was the onset of the very messianic era. This was messianic. This was redemptive. This was the beginning of the redemption. And the way they look at the war was, the victory was a miracle and a very significant stage in the ultimate redemption. Generally speaking, in Israeli lingo, these groups of Jews are either called Mizrahi, if you ever heard of Mizrahi, this is a Mizrahi, religious, very pro-Zionism, and they're also known as Kippa Sruga. Their kippah that they have, knitted kippahs. That's a classic of the way they dress. They're called Kippa Sruga. So it's like, how do you define them? By the kippah, Kippa Sruga. Some of them have beards, some of them don't have beards. If you ever see anybody in Israel with a Kippa Sruga, you'll see a soldier. And these people are in Israel, and they're all in it. Everything that happens in the government is messianic. We're in the process of the Messiah coming. The 6 Day War was very, very messianic for them. The holy cities, and these are also what we refer to as the settlers, the Gush movements, the settlers. These are the people who believe part of the Messianic era, we need to go and settle and live in every single piece of land. And these are the people, just in today's news I saw, that they just went and established a new peace and Israel had to go, and it's messy. But these are the people who are always pushing more settlements. They're not just doing it, they're very ideologically driven. Everything we do more is a further step in the process of the ongoing coming of the Messiah. Again, it's a little bit of a minority. It's a little bit fringe to say that Messiah has already come. That's what they say. We're in the process. Messiah is already here. These are the people who are already starting to rebuild the Holy Temple. They've already rebuilt many of the parts of the Holy Temple, of course, off-site, because they're like, we're in the process. We got to start building. So these are people who are very ideologically driven. Most of the religious group, again, most religious Jews say it's a bit of a stretch to say that we're already in the Messianic era. If you really look at the details of how it's meant to look like, how it's meant to unfold, it doesn't really seem to fit the criteria that we're already there. Maybe we're very close to being there, we're not there yet. But this is a 4th group. 4 groups, how are we doing? Okay, now these people supported, just by the way, the early Zionists, even when they were so anti-religion. And they're like, yeah, they're saying horrible stuff, but this is really part of God's plan, how he's going to bring the Messiah. So they're like, we don't care about it. This was like a very ideal, if any of you are familiar a little bit, Rabbi Isaac Cook, the first chief rabbi of Israel. He was one of the biggest leaders of the religious pro-Zionist movement. And that's that. Okay, we have 4 different groups over here. A little bit of a panoramic understanding, getting the spectrum of different opinions of Jews, from the very secular atheists, even to the very far right religious. I want to conclude today's class with one final historical piece, which is there's really a 5th group, or a group which is actually totally not part of this equation because there's no dissonance. Most Jews experience dissonance, which means there was an expectation before the war, and the reality after the war was just very, very different, drastically different. And there was one person who actually never had any cognitive dissonance, and it's an unbelievable piece of Israeli history, and that was the Rebbe, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson. You see his picture there. We're going to read what he says. And before the war, I'm also going to show you the video of the speech because it's unbelievable. Before the war, right? This is not after the war. Before the war, he publicly came out with this statement. Let's read text 14. Rabbi you, Larry? Yes. Text 14, page 199.
Regarding the current situation in Israel, our brothers and sisters that reside in the Holy Land, in the land of Israel, are currently under God's protection. God is sending them his blessings and his salvation in great abundance, and they will successfully emerge from the present state of affairs. God, with his full, open, holy, and generous hand, will extricate the residents of Israel from all difficulty, and he will give them peace and security as for all their needs.
So Rebbe comes out with like really even a form of prophecy, you could say, and say, it's not going to happen. There's a lot of danger. It is very scary, but God is going to perform miracles. Israel right away exploded with this. In fact, when the Rebbe said, we're watching the video, they had this speech spoken live. It was transmitted live on Israeli radios in Kol Yisrael. And anybody who asked the Rebbe about leaving or changing plans, about traveling to Israel, somebody had a wedding a week in 2 weeks, which is right after the war, but then somebody had a wedding in Israel. They said, maybe we should move the whole wedding to New York. And the Rebbe stood behind this very, very strongly. Let's read text 15, 3 short answers from the Rebbe in the days before the 6-Day War, and then we'll watch some videos. Max, we're up to you. Text 15.
I is Langsam Brodal Schwartz, Yeshiva Torah MS, POB 5024 Jerusalem. In response to your telegram, continue your Torah study with complete dedication, along with the other students. Without any shadow of a doubt, the guardian of Israel neither slumbers nor sleeps. May you share good news. The wedding will be in its auspicious hour, in its designated time in the Holy Land. For there, God has assured blessing and life for all eternity. I am very displeased by the panic and exaggerations. God will protect all those whom you referenced among them, all our brethren, the children of Israel, wherever they may be, and specifically those residing in the land where God's eyes are constantly upon it.
It was amazing. In Israeli newspapers, every single day they kept on quoting the Rebbe because this had a very calming effect on the people. And in fact, the generals and commanders would invite the Chabad Hasidim in Israel to come speak to the soldiers to reassure them, because they were coming with the Rebbe's words. In fact, the president of Israel, who was the president of Israel during the war? His name was Zalman Shazar. Zalman Shazar was actually a Chabad boy from the Haim. When he grew up in Russia. His last name was actually Rubashov, and his name is Shneer Zalman. He's named after the founder of the Chabad movement. And his father was already kind of a little bit pulled into the Enlightenment movement, and this young Shneer Zalman was especially pulled into it and became a leader of it. But he always kept very strong ties to Chabad, even though he really left Chabad and became very secular. And he spoke with the Rebbe before the war, and the Rebbe told him, "I'm telling you, nothing's going to happen. God is protecting. You're going to see miracles are going to happen." And he was calm before the war. He was the only person in Israel who was calm. He says, "I spoke to the Rebbe. The Rebbe said everything's fine. I'm not worried." So I want to share with you right now a video, unbelievable video, and we will see and watch the Rebbe's talk. So Shauna, go right for it.
May 28, 1967, was a day of three pivotal speeches. In Cairo, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser held an international press conference. In Tel Aviv, Israeli Prime Minister Eshkol spoke to the people of Israel. And in New York, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, addressed world Jewry. Each of these messages attracted extreme attention. After all, it was only 8 days before the Middle East would be plunged into war. Before hundreds of the world's press, Nasser unabashedly broadcast Egypt's intentions. The existence of Israel is in itself an aggression. We will not accept any coexistence with Israel. The war with Israel is in effect since 1948. In plain words, the Arab armies led by Egypt intended to wipe Israel off the map. This was not an empty threat. Egypt, Syria, and Jordan were mobilizing vast armies on Israel's border and broadcasting the same intentions. On the same day, Prime Minister Eshkol delivered a message over the waves of Israel's national radio station Kol Yisrael. While Nasser had spent weeks rallying the Middle East to a combined military onslaught against an isolated Israel, Eshkol had maintained an ominous silence since the start of the crisis. He now decided to reassure the jittery public that the IDF was adequately prepared to defend itself and that Israel was navigating a diplomatic resolution through international channels. Neither was fully true. The military intelligence and civilian leaderships all predicted impending disaster. The Israeli public was already bracing itself for the most horrifying possibilities. Eshkol stumbled nervously, and Israel trembled. Shimon Peres later described the effect of Eshkol's fumbled address.
Eshkol's radio speech was simply traumatic. In retrospect, one could probably say that the public overreacted. But at the time, when you didn't know what is going to happen, and the whole world is applauding Nasser, at a time when we lost our self-confidence, and the worst doubts were voiced, the impression it created was of doubt and fear.
An Israeli colonel wrote, "With his stuttering, he conveyed more insecurity and confusion. I heard that soldiers at the front burst out crying." An already alarmed Israel was thrown into panic. That same day, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, head of the Chabad Lubavitch movement, and a revered spiritual leader of world Jewry, delivered a public address that was broadcast around the globe, including a simultaneous translation from Yiddish to Hebrew on Israel's Kol Yisrael radio station that Eshkol had used only hours earlier. It was Lag BaOmer, a day of great rejoicing and mystical significance in the Jewish calendar. This year, though, Jewish hearts worldwide winced in worry over the existential threat that hung over the Jews of Israel. They had reason to fear, for it was now the Sunday before the outbreak of war. The Rebbe had called for a grand Lag BaOmer Jewish Children's Parade to publicly express Jewish pride and to encourage Torah observance. 20,000 Jewish school children from across America heeded the call, gathering with their parents and educators in the giant leaf-lined boulevard facing the Rebbe's headquarters in Brooklyn, New York. The Rebbe personally addressed the rally, but his forceful prediction took the world by surprise.
Was eure Brüder und Schwestern, was gefühlen sich in Eretz Akedesh in Eretz Israel, stehen nicht in einem Lager, wo der Rebeste beschützt sie und schickt sie seine Brüche und Atzloche und Yeshua in ein vergrößerter Moss, gedei sie sollen rauskommen und sie wollen rauskommen von dem ichtigen Maße mit Atzloche und damit ist das mit Kuye. Das, was wir haben gelernt in den sederen Nächten, als wir schafften, das Wetter beherzigen, als eben in Eretz Israel werden sitzen dort sicher, wenn man sagt, ich schaue im Behoret, aber der Oberste wird manchmal sein, also sei Scholem in Eretz Agdesha, der Hisi Lochem Lolikim, was Eretz Yarisviden, בידי המויה הפסוכה הקדושה והרחובה, von sein breiter und offener und voller Hand, von allen Schwierigkeiten und was sie bringen, in Schulen und Bettach, in allem, in was sie nötig sagt, und bekoren Mamash.
A singular voice of optimism in a universe of despair. The Rebbe's words electrified the Israeli public. Newspapers across Israel, regardless of affiliation, from Haaretz to Al HaMishmar, converted the Rebbe's astonishing message into headlines of hope. God is watching over the Holy Land, and salvation is near, cried the headlines of Yediot Achronot, an Israeli daily. The prediction seemed so utterly at odds with that of Israel's own leadership and the grim reality growing ever more dense around Israel's borders, just 8 days shy of the Six-Day War.
All right, one more video. And again, this is on the next text that we read, where we had some of these responses.
Now the war is coming. 1967 Shat Chirum. Get 2 notices from the American embassy. War is imminent. Transportation will not be provided. No responsibility will be taken. Leave the country immediately. We have 2 Americans, 1 Canadian, 1 Brit. So read the Rebbe telegram to all 4 of us. What should we do? Should we stay or should we leave?
This letter what we sent was before Lag B'Ema. I remember I went to the post office to send the telegram to the Rebbe. The Lashon was Eichlis Nayeg Le'era Matzav.
What goes behind the scenes is that American yeshiva boys were clogging the airport trying to leave the country. And it was very bad for the morale of the country. And the Rebbe knew that. And that's why his telegram to us was printed in Daf Rishon of newspaper. And the telegram read as follows. Yamshichu בהתמדה ובשקידה, ובוודאי לא ינום ולא יישן שומר ישראל, ויבשרו טוב.
The yeshiva was about 200 feet from the border. Across the street, there was the barbed wire from Jordan. So the government asked if we can help for the war effort. They asked if we should go and help dig trenches next to the border. A lot of trucks came with sand. They dumped it on the corners of the streets. So everybody can go and fill up the sacks with sand, put it on the windows. So when the bombs fall, the shrapnel shouldn't break the glass and go into the houses. After the yeshiva, there was one more building. It was Masad HaChinuch, a very big, strong building over there. And they shared a backyard with the yeshiva. And in that backyard, the soldiers set up mortars to shoot across the border. So they were there a few days before the war started. They were setting up the things with the bombs and everything to get ready. So they gave all of us rifles and submachine guns, and everybody got an Uzi. They taught us how to take it apart and put it together. If they break through, you just stand by the window and you just shoot anything that moves outside. Just keeps raking the street with the bullets.
I had friends in the mirror, and I told them the Rebbe's telegram. So they asked him, Chaim Shmulevitz in the mirror, should we stay or should we go? He said, that's not a question for me. I'm not taking responsibility for your lives. And they said, our friend in Chabad, the Chabadski Rebbe took responsibility for him. He said, don't move. He said, the Lubavitcher Rebbe had break the places. He just took responsibility for thousands of lives.
This is like the fifth category where there's actually, and the Rebbe maintained that. And we'll be talking a little bit more next week as well about the Rebbe's messaging before the war. And the conversation continues next week. So I hope tonight was a very informative class for all of you. I want to also add that when you think about what's happening today, within Israel, many want to give away land. Within Israel, there are some which say not an inch. We want to settle on every piece of land. The political processes, the political discussions that are happening. How do we fight? How do we go to war? How do we defend ourselves? What you start realizing is all of these are actually reflections of one of these four different categories that we've explored tonight. I hope it was very informative. I hope it opened up your mind a little bit more. And next week, a miraculous victory is on the way, said the Rebbe. Next week, our last class of this course, the topic is a nation that dwells alone, Israel's relations with the family of nations. Why is there so much anti-Israel bias? Actually, just saw today a graph. What is the most hated country in every country? In every country, which country do they hate the most? Israel. You look at the map, and it's like half of it is Israel. It's crazy. So that'll be next week's topic. How do we make sense of and how do we navigate the idea that the world is so against us? I want to wish you all a wonderful night. Thank you for joining. If you have any questions, we could stay here. I rushed a little bit through, 1 second. I rushed a little bit through all the four categories. And there's also a lot of, I should actually mention this. None of these are monolithic. There's actually so many subcategories and there's so much nuance in the conversations and the debate and, but this is a general idea. I want to thank you all for joining. We'll see you all next week. And if you have any questions, feel free to stay on.